Good morning, everybody. Can everybody hear me?
Yes, sir.
Good, thank you. My name is Mike Warden. I'm one of the two inspectors appointed to examine the Brentwood local plan. Everybody in the meeting, I think, has been to previous sessions, so I won't go through our housekeeping rules, but can I just introduce Yvonne Wright, who will be running this session with me. I'm going to open in respect to transport, but we'll both be taking this session, and then Mrs. Wright will be leading on air quality this morning. Can I just then go through the participants? I've just heard what Annette has said about TrailNet and Redrow, but can I just invite all the participants here just to introduce themselves so that we know who we've got here and the people on the live stream know who is here. And can I start with the council, please?
Yes, sir. Good morning. My name is Paul Shedderevian QC, and I'm acting for the council. I'm going to ask each of the council's participants to introduce themselves, please.
Good morning, Inspector Jonathan Quilter, Strategic Planning Manager at Brentwood Council. I'll pass to my colleague Tom.
Good morning, Inspector. My name is Tom Huang, Senior Policy Planner at Brentwood Borough Council.
Good morning, Inspector. My name is David Ibaka, Transport Consultant to Brentwood Borough Council.
Good morning, Inspector. I'm Andrea Pearson, Senior Planning Policy Officer at Brentwood Borough Council.
Good morning, Inspector. I'm Margaret Theobald. I'm from Stantec, and I'm being supported by my colleague, Paul Gebbett.
Thank you.
I think we have one other. I don't know if he's online. Matt, air quality.
Yeah, good morning. My name's Matt Williams. I carried out the air quality modelling for the council.
Thank you. Okay, thank you. And next on my list is Highways England. Please.
Oh yes, good morning, sir. My name's Janice Burgess for Highways England, a Special Planning Manager.
Thank you.
Good morning, sir. My name's Nigel Walkton. I'm from the consultancy Jacobs. We're the Special Planning Consultants to Highways England, and I've been examining the impacts of the traffic from the local plan upon the strategic road network.
Thank you. And for Essex County Council.
Good morning, Inspectors. My name is Mark Robinson, Principal Transportation and Infrastructure Planner at Essex County Council, supported by James Whiffin from Jacobs for any technical matters.
Thank you. CEG, please.
Good morning, Inspectors. David Barnes. With me today is Mike Axon of Vectus.
Thank you. Mr. Barnes, St Modwin.
Good morning, sir. Good morning, all. Sam Hollingworth, Stratton Parker, on behalf of St Modwin and S&J Padfield and Partners. I'm also joined by my colleague, Mr. Firth, who has detailed background knowledge in the history of the Brentwood Park, and also Steve Catesmark, our transport consultant of Atkins, if you do require any further detail around transport proposals there. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And then next on my list is the Priest Lane Residents Group.
Good morning, sir. Good morning, sir. It's Kate Webster representing Priest Lane.
Thank you. Tesco, please. Jill Hearn.
Good morning, sir. Rupert Warren, QC for Tesco, instructed by Jill Hearn. I'll introduce the other members of the team, many of whom may not speak. It'll depend on how things go, but Selwyn Atkinson, who I know you've met before, from Jill Hearn on planning. Then his colleagues on air quality, Joseph Simona and Amy van der Sander, and Andrew MacDonald of Watermans on transport. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. West Horndon Parish Council.
Good morning. My name is Colin Fone and I'm Vice Chair of West Hornham Parish Council. Could I please ask that I'm allowed to speak? I wish to raise really only two issues in connection with the first item on the agenda, but I need to go childminding while my daughter gets her COVID jab. So could I ask that I'm allowed to say what I need to say before noon today, please?
Indeed, Mr. Fone.
Thank you very much.
Is what you're wanting to say in relation to the transport policies or their quality? I think transport, isn't it, from what you've just alluded to?
It is the transport policy, yes, and it would be bullet point 5 on item 1 that I really want to speak about.
Okay, thank you. And Mr. Minot. Is Mr. Minot here?
Yes, thank you, sir. Mr. Minot, Brentwood councillor, but obviously, as we've said before, not acting as a Brentwood councillor in this capacity, speaking as a member of the public, as it were.
Thank you, Mr. Minot. And just to check that Red Row haven't arrived. Pegasus planning, not here. Okay, thanks.
No.
And is there anybody here who I've not invited to introduce themselves? No. Okay. Thank you very much. Thank you. Okay. So today, this morning, really, we're intending to run this session in 2 parts. We'll deal first with transport, and then we'll deal with air quality. The intention is that once we've dealt with transport, we shall have a break, and then move on to air quality. So that will enable those people who don't wish to stay for air quality to leave. So we'll have a break mid-morning, depending on how we go, and hopefully that break will be where we finish on transport. Just to set some background in relation to transport, whilst we've set the agenda, that agenda has to some extent moved on from where we were, because of, for example, the discussion that we had yesterday with Highways England, which was a focused discussion on where we were on the updated transport assessment. And that discussion yesterday, which was live streamed, I think, or was certainly, we had some problems yesterday on live streaming, but it is available for viewing, was very helpful to help us as inspectors understand where we are in relation to the updated transport modelling and the position of Highways England. And we will come on to that when we look particularly at policy BE16, which has been circulated, I believe, this morning or last night to participants. So I did hear Annette asking everybody whether they have seen those policies that have been circulated, BE11 and BE16. Can everybody just confirm that they've received those? Mr. Warren.
Yes, so as far as Tesco is concerned, and I know that I heard conversations with Ms. Feeney that others have received them. We received them at about 9:05 this morning. I obviously I'm anticipating anyway, and from what you've just said, sir, that there's going to be some introduction to what they say. I mean, as simple as that, pretty early in the two sessions, so that we can at least take stock of what's on the table, as it were, for discussion, because obviously we haven't had any practical opportunity to see the direction of travel or what's now being proposed. And I don't want to make a song and a dance about it, but if we have an opportunity at least to have explained to us what is being proposed in those potential changes, we can at least then take stock of where that leaves us in terms of what we might want to say or can say. take it in stages, really, sir, rather than proceed immediately to talk about how unfair it might be if the whole discussion takes place without us having had a proper opportunity to have a look at that material. If we could start with an explanation of what they are.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Warren. Have any other participant? Well, has every participant seen those policies? Albeit you've only seen them this morning, but has everybody got them in front of them effectively? So when we come to them, Mr. Barnes is nodding, Kate Webster's nodding, Sam Hollingworth is nodding. Thank you. Everybody's nodding. Thank you. So that is helpful. Thank you. Now, in terms of transport, we will be focusing today on highways matters. We have dealt with the sustainable transport matters elsewhere in the hearing sessions, and we've also been through every individual site that is proposed to be allocated. So we're not proposing to go over those matters. We're just dealing with the strategic transport matters so far as they relate to highways for the first part of this morning. Having taken note of what Mr. Warren has said, which I think is very helpful, can I invite as council or Highways England to just briefly explain where things have been left after yesterday's discussion, and so that that context and background is there for participants today when we come on to look at, I think, particularly policy BE16, which has got some proposed changes to it in light of that discussion.
Yeah, would it be helpful if I introduce the policies in line with Mr. Warren's request?
Indeed.
And then I will go on then to discuss where we are and what's now being proposed. So BE11 is Strategic Transport Infrastructure Policy. As it is in the deposit draft plan, it deals with railway connectivity, multimodal integration, train stations, and delivering improvements to highway infrastructure capacity. And that's dealt with at a fairly high level in that policy. I don't think there's anything there's nothing controversial about it. It requires that any significant impacts, for example, from development on the transport network on highway safety, must be effectively mitigated to an acceptable degree in line with policy BE16. BE16 is a policy that deals with the mitigation of transport impacts and requires developments not to have an unacceptable transport impact or any significant impacts from development on the transport network in terms of capacity, congestion, and highway safety. And then it sets out requirements for new development, including the submission of travel plans, transport assessments, etc., and also requires reasonable and proportionate financial contributions and mitigation measures where necessary to mitigate any impacts. Now, those two policies have a degree of overlap, and BE16 also overlapped with contributions policies as well in the plan. And although they don't have any formal status at the moment, the local authority proposed some modifications to both of those policies, as well as many others, in the document which I hope my learned friend is aware of, which is F9A. The discussion, I will just say one more thing about those two policies and potential modifications. Having looked at the original drafting and having looked at the F9A informally proposed modifications, it seems to me that BE 11 and 16 can be merged into one policy and the duplication stripped out. But I make that observation for future discussion. Be that as it may, B16 is now the subject of further discussion, having being given consideration by the Highways Agency in light of the outcome of yesterday's discussions. And what the Highways England, is looking to do is to augment that policy by adding words to the requirement of that policy in relation to the submission of travel plans and transport assessments. And I'll read out what it says. This is B16 A. BA. It says that the local authority, new development will be required to submit travel plans, transport assessments and or statements in accordance with the thresholds and detailed requirements for each land use category as set out in the Essex County Council's development management policies or its successors. The wording which Highways England would like to see in there is as follows. So that remains the same, but with the additional words, and engage in a full assessment process with Highways England where development has a potential for material impact on the strategic road network. So I'll repeat that. And engage in a full assessment process with Highways England where development has a potential for material impact on the strategic road network. So that's the addition which is being proposed to B16, and which would be included in any reformatting of the policies or merger of the policies should the inspectors deem it necessary to take that course. So I hope that explains the background to this.
Thank you very much, Mr. Shadow Dravian. I just, before we move on, I'm aware Mr. Phone wanted to make an early comment, and I would just like to invite Mr. Phone if he'd like to make his comment now. At least then we will have heard it.
I would like to say thank you very much, Inspector, for that. I very much appreciate it. Before I say what I'm going to say, I'd like to put what I'm going to say into context. West Horsham Parish Council is a small parish council. We have 7 councillors and 1 part-time parish clerk, and the total annual budget of less than £35,000 a year. We are planning amateurs, and we don't have the resources to use to bring consultants in. So we are amateurs at it, and although on a couple of occasions we've sought some professional guidance, we are amateurs. However, from your planning perspective, as a planning inspector, I'm therefore sorry that we might not have read all the documents, or we might have missed bits and pieces, and we also, will we have understood all the legal and planning terminology? I very much doubt it. But we do our best, and I ask you to bear with us. But we do have one real major advantage that we can give you that nobody else around this table can. And that is that we live in the area and we see what goes on day in, day out, every day of the year. And in my case, it's for over 38 years. I would wish to emphasise that we are not a NIMBY organisation. For instance, we were the people who suggested the development of Dunton Hills Garden Village very early back in Brentwood Council's development plan. But we do believe that when development takes place, it must be, and I emphasise must be, supported by appropriate infrastructure, and that infrastructure should be delivered at an appropriate time. And when development is taking place, that does mean that the infrastructure needs to go in before development starts, so that all the construction, traffic and other things are in place, not having to disrupt everybody. So, the transport infrastructure, and I'm going to raise just 2 issues for you. if you look at the local development plan in the West Horndon area, nearly all the development is justified because West Horndon is identified as a transport corridor or a transport hub. And at one level, that makes total sense. However, you do need to look at it a little more carefully. So let's look at the A127, the transport corridor. Cannot deny that at present that road is grossly over capacity, traffic jams every rush hour, and there are lots of incidents where the road blocks and then traffic rat runs through West Horndon. In just the last couple of months, there have been 2 serious accidents on that road. The first one was close to where the A127 and the B186 junction is, and the road was closed, and rat run traffic through West Horndon, down Thorndon Avenue, down Childerditch Lane, down other lanes off the A127, meant that there was the traffic built up from where St Mary's Lane joins the B186 right back into West Horndon. This is unacceptable, and as development increases, it is undoubtedly true that there will be more accidents and incidents, and that must be sorted out before, and I must emphasise, in our view, before the development starts. There was another one where there was an incident between the Halfway House and the Dunton Waylitz roundabout. But on that occasion, the road was closed and traffic backed up miles back to Raleigh Weir roundabout. There are many other examples, but I have to say that when you look at the reports that come out from all sorts of people, they significantly underestimate the number of incidents. And that is because, talking to police officers, when there is an incident, police officers have to decide whether or not they report that incident or not. And if they think, if they're in the grey area of discretion, they don't report it because it takes a long time to do. They're already overworked. So what I can tell you is that the reports of incidents on the highway are significantly less than the reports that what you will see in the reports. So I ask you as an inspector to make sure that before construction work commences around West Horndon, and I think it would be wise around the rest of Brentwood, that appropriate road infrastructure upgrades are done, because failure to do that would be, in our view, an utter disgrace. We've looked at lots of plans that have been put forward, and to be honest, they're all high level. None of them really hold any substance to be able to judge whether they would do anything. The other point I wish to make is the access to West Horndon Station. Once again, West Horndon Station is clearly identified as a very important justification for Dunton Hills Garden Village. Indeed, Dunton Hills Garden Village, there's plans and proposals to do a nice junction between the village, Station Road and the A128. But there's no plans to get from the village boundary towards the station. The idea of having a cycle path down there is just a nonsense. There's no space for it. In fact, when you get to the junction of Thorndon Avenue and Station Road, the pavement there is so narrow that people, if you have 2 pedestrians going in the opposite direction to each other, they can't pass each other, let alone at COVID distance levels. So this is a real accident asking to happen. We're going to significantly increase the number of people using West Horndon Station, but there's no firm plan in place at present to be able to cope with that. I will also refer to the junction by the station, the pub and the existing industrial estate. Once again, if all these developments take place, this exceedingly dangerous junction at the present minute, and there has been a fatality there, although fortunately not in recent years, but there's no plan to do anything about it. You just listen to officers say, oh, we'll sort something. That is not acceptable. There must be a plan, and it must be implemented before traffic starts to increase, especially because the construction traffic will significantly increase the load on the existing already fragile network. So all I am saying to you is we ask you to make sure that when this local development plan is approved, that there are proper plans in place for upgrading the highways infrastructure so that there is no significant increase to people's risk to people's lives. There is no significant disruption to existing communities. And I ask you, please, to take that up. As I say, we can't cope with looking at all the mountain of documents. They're absolutely huge. We try to read them, but we're not professionals. But we do know that there only needs to be a minor incident on the A127 and traffic runs through this village at speed, and speed limits just don't take any notice of it. They don't take any notice of anything. So thank you very much, Inspector, and I really do appreciate you listening to me early on. It's very kind of you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Foe. Thank you. That's very helpful. Thank you. Mr. Foe, and if you wish to leave at any point because you have to, then please feel free to.
I will stay and listen until I have to go. So thank you for letting me make my point early. Very much appreciated.
Thank you. So can we just look at policy BE11 first? And Mr. Shire-Davian has helpfully outlined the background to the changes which the council is now informally proposing to the inspectors. And I'd like to invite any other contributions from participants in relation to, first of all, policy B11. Mr. Hollingsworth.
Thank you, sir. Clearly, it's already been touched upon. We've only had a very limited time to consider this, and that's in no way intended to be a criticism of anyone. I appreciate this is a moving process and an iterative one. But just some initial thoughts on some of the modifications. I think firstly, we would question whether the policy as proposed to be modified makes clear to a future decision maker that contributions demanded can only be those that are necessary to make a particular development acceptable in planning terms. And I'm thinking in particular the reference to cumulative impacts there. That to me seems to be more intended as a reference to how future impacts will be considered, as is the standard practice, obviously, with the highway mitigation measures would be to consider committed growth and potential impacts, etc. But I suppose, okay, this is somewhat on the hoof, frankly, sir, but whether a future decision maker might consider that should be applied more widely, that might cause some confusion. And the second initial thought, and apologies, this is rather pedantic, but I note that the reason and relevant docs column of the proposed modification says that the policy modification is to improve effectiveness. Clearly, either the submitted policy is either effective or it is not, and it is not our place to improve that policy. So, actually, if this policy is merely this modification rather is merely seeking to improve the policy, then it cannot be made through this process. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Hollingworth. Just to be clear in terms of the policy, the majority of the policy that has been circulated now is set out within document F9A, which has been before the examination for some considerable time. So certainly the reference to cumulative impacts of planned growth, for example, is within that F9A policy, and I think what the council is now suggesting is some further amendments to that policy. And the point about effectiveness, it was set out in F9A that it was to make the policy effective was the reason for that modification. So, but I take the point, Mr. Hollingworth. I've got Mr. Warren and then Mr. Robinson. Can I don't know who was first, but I'll deal with Mr. Warren first.
Thanks. I think actually I was second, but thank you very much. I've been obviously corresponding via WhatsApp as usual on these occasions with my team, and about what we can say to help the examination on the new wording. And I mean the new wording. It's partly, sir, because we noted yesterday that there is the emerging idea of an immediate review of the plan that's come forward. Again, informally, I think is the right way to express it, and that does have an effect, it seems to us, on the effectiveness of these policies as well. So that's part of the reason we're a little uncomfortable today. But I'm assuming, sir, that if these changes or something like them with the HE addition are taken forward, then there would be a formal process of consultation on those modifications, to which we and other parties would be able to contribute. Because if there isn't, I have to say it is very difficult indeed. I'm not criticising anybody, as Mr. Hollingworth didn't, but it's about the soundness and the fairness of the process, really, that I'm concerned with. It's very, very difficult for us to say the things that we might, on proper consideration, say about the new wording when we've only had 15 minutes to see it and no chance at all to discuss it before we started the hearing. So I mean, the questions that we have are really procedural at this stage, because they in the new wording affect, for instance, how paying for the relevant infrastructure is going to be divided between the sites that are allocated in the plan at the moment, and how they're going to relate to sites that might be coming forward through an immediate review. Because obviously, if you're an allocated site, whether the contributions are by 106 or by SIL or by a combination, you don't want to be paying at a certain rate when another however many units are also going to be having an effect cumulatively on the road network and those infrastructure. You know, will they get a rebate? All of those issues arise. So we that's the kind of issue that we'd like to be able to explore properly. I've just flagged it up really as an indication of why this isn't a whinge, as it were, about a late document, but it does actually go to the nuts and bolts of whether the plan is workable. I mean, my first question really is, these changes, I take it, will be the subject of a formal modifications process allowing for additional contributions and to be made by representatives.
Well, any modifications that that would put forward would be subject to the formal modification process.
And so obviously that means that you and Ms. Wright would be looking at what we and others said on the formal modifications process before reaching a view about overall soundness, etc., of the plan. I mean, I think that's of some comfort. It does make our contribution, and I suspect those of others today, of less value to you than they otherwise would be had we had a bit more time to consider them, for which I apologise. But if we're safeguarded in terms of the overall process by the ability to make representations on the formal consultation that deals with that point, it makes our contributions today on the specific points arising on the new material very difficult, obviously.
So, Mr. Warren, what in relation to policy BE11, are your concerns about BE11 and BE16, or one of the two policies?
Well, they're about both, because I think there is a relationship between the two, and as Mr. Shadarivian said, between contributions policies and the IDP as well, and indeed about the relationship between this and any review of the plan, which go to overall soundness. They go, for instance, to whether it's right at the moment to wrap up this plan and have an immediate review, or whether actually it would be better to extend the process for another however many months it would be, so that those matters can be dealt with in 21, 22, rather than having a review which might go to 2025. So it's more complicated than simply saying, well, I've got a concern about that word or that word. And as I say, sir, again, I think it's fair that it's quite difficult to say. It's quite difficult for us to point to specific issues that arise on the new wording to assist you when we literally haven't had a reasonable chance to have a look at what it says.
Can I intervene?
Yes, please, Mr. Shadavian.
The plan which is being examined at the moment is the deposit one. So the policies which are formally being considered are those in the published document. F9A was submitted by the council as a means of assisting the inspectors and other participants in identifying where the policies might be made effective, or to get rid of things like duplication, to take into account any changed circumstances. And as you said, sir, they've been available for some period of time. They don't form a formal part of this process at the moment. They're there only to assist consideration of whether or not the policies should be modified to make them more effective, and to make the plan sound overall. And that will be an issue which will be considered through the modifications process, and due process will allow those interested in the outcome to make representations. And it shouldn't be forgotten also that we have spent a considerable amount of time discussing individual policies throughout the previous sessions, where proposed changes to these policies ought to be thought about. And one of those, as a matter which will, I think, concern Mr. Phone, was the way in which we approach strategic allocations, and also the contributions policies, and also the infrastructure policies, so as to enable the provision for retrospective payments to those who provide infrastructure upfront, to the fair sharing of expenses in relation to the provision of strategic infrastructure, and also an appropriate basis upon which to restructure some of the strategic allocation policies, so as to make sure that they provide an adequate framework within which to impose an appropriate regime of conditions and planning obligations to ensure that infrastructure is delivered at an appropriate stage of the development. So I don't think there's anything about these proposed changes that go that change in substance what the plan is there to achieve. It's merely the way in which, or the mechanisms by which those objectives can be achieved, having regard to the need to provide infrastructure in a timely manner.
Thank you,
May
Mr.
I come back very briefly?
Yes, Mr. Warren, please do.
I'm grateful to my learned friend. I mean, that's very helpful, and as I anticipated, obviously a modifications process would safeguard my client's interests and those of others in terms of the overall process. My learned friend said that these informal, at this stage, wording changes are there to assist you to decide whether modifications should be made, and of course, if that's the principal issue that we're considering, then we would say yes, obviously modifications of some kind do need to be made. The finer grain of that takes us back to my point about not having had enough time to assist you properly on the extent to which those changes indicate that modification should be made. So I just make that point. But I'm not sure, having had a look at the changes literally as we've been on air, that I quite accept that there's nothing here really that goes to soundness, because, for instance, the wording, which I haven't seen in writing, but which Mr. Shadreven helpfully read out, suggested by Highways England, that sites that are allocated have full engagement where strategic road network impacts may flow, so as to lead to the development, no doubt, of mitigation packages. Does, at least on the face of it, doesn't it raise the issue as to whether the strategic road network impacts have been adequately assessed at the date the plan is made? Because it looks like that is leaving open potentially substantial issues on what's needed, whether it can be paid for, by whom, over what period, etc., whether it's deliverable, to post-plan application and implementation stages. And that's a bit of a concern, obviously, about workability of the overall plan. That's just an example that I picked up from what we've said so far. So my overall point here, sir, is that we will, I think when I say we, certainly my clients, others obviously will speak for themselves, but we will need at least some time post today to make some written representation on what we've heard about these wording changes. And we don't need very long, but my suggestion would be that we be, say, given a week to write in anything that we've got about those, having heard the debate. Because otherwise, as I say, I'm not going to speak on this point again, this general process point again, but during the day we'll be, running like fury to try and catch up and take on board what's being said, and we won't have time fairly to formulate anything sensible to assist you and Ms. Wright. So that would be the suggestion I'd make, kind of pro tem, to plug the gap in process terms.
Thank you very much, Mr. Warren. Thank you. Mr. Robinson, been waiting very patiently. Thank you.
Thank you, Inspector. My point was in relation to the wording of B11 in the policy relating to strategic transport infrastructure. We'd normally expect to see strategic highways interventions listed in the policy. So I just wanted to make that point, but I think reading through, there is a reference in the policy to the priority 1 items in the IDP, but it's just whether they should be also listed in the policy itself. I've got another point about the early review policy that's been discussed, but I don't know if you want to come back to that.
Well, please, which policy?
Sorry, the policy related to the early review of the plan. I'm not sure we've got a reference number yet. Just to reiterate that the Essex County Council would like to see specific reference to sustainable transport and improvements to the local highways network captured in that policy, as well as just the strategic transport network improvements that are listed.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Robinson. Mr. Minot, I think, has had his hand up for some time. Then Mr. Hollingworth, and then Mr. Barnes. Mr. Minot.
Thank you, Chair. So, yeah, a couple of questions really. One of them, I mean, maybe to start at the end, as it were, and this is an illustration of how complicated all of these things get. I've just gone back and double checked the F9A changes to B11. I go back because of my council involvement. I go back to the printed version of the local plan, which was what the councillors actually voted in favour of, or the administration on the council actually voted in favour of. And in terms of B11, at that stage, there was a paragraph in that policy which related to development close to schools. It was actually the last paragraph in the policy as it stood at that stage. And it was talking about facilitating attractive public realm and encouraging walking and cycling, what have you. I'm guessing that has now at some stage been taken out of there and redistributed between other policies. But I thought I would just mention it, given that it was originally in B11. There's also the points which have already been raised about when infrastructure goes in, and the comment actually that was made just shortly beforehand by Mr. Shadrevian in terms of ensuring infrastructure is delivered at an appropriate stage in the development and in a timely manner. The problems which are faced by Councillor Fone in West Horndon and West Horndon Parish Council and the residents down there are extremely significant because of the strategic nature of the Dundon Hills project in that parish, literally in that parish. But one of my huge concerns has always been in relation to the cumulative effect of the numerous town centre development sites. The question as to where and when infrastructure is actually provided in relation to the drip of smaller sites which individually don't have a strategic effect, but cumulatively are one of the two main concentrations of residential development which is actually being proposed by the local plan. And I have to say I've asked questions at various stages, and we've had conversations at various stages on this, but right at this late stage, I still am not aware of any. Well, clarification would be useful, but the other thing beyond clarification would be assurance. Anything that somebody was telling me which was reliable, which made me feel that the infrastructure infrastructure changes that would be necessary within the Brentwood / Shenfield town centre areas in order to deal with in the real world with the cumulative impact of numerous sites which traffic from which would all be impacting the same roads and the same junctions. I'm still not aware of anything that I have ever seen under any heading in any meeting which is giving me an assurance that the infrastructure changes that would need to come in will come in and at the appropriate stage in relation to the way in which the effects of those developments will take force, because it's clearly not a case that the process of going through the application for the individual developments any of those individual developments will actually trigger those infrastructure changes or will have required the infrastructure changes already to have taken place before that application comes in. That's a very different kind of process. And one of my fundamental criticisms of the plan for a long while has been that in my view, you search in vain for any section of some of the major documents in the plan which says we acknowledge that there are all of these developments which are being proposed in close proximity to one another. They will have a cumulative effect. Because they will have a cumulative effect, this is how we propose to address the cumulative problems, and this is where the infrastructure changes will come in. This is how that will be financed. This is how in the real world a solution to those problems will be arrived at. I still have not seen any of that. So I think that those are significant concerns. And I also just have a question really, which is I suppose a technical question, and there may be a straightforward technical answer to it, which is the point that Highways England, that we've been told Highways England would like to add, the phrasing that they would like to add, obviously in relation to BE16 in fact, but I think it spills over, this business of engaging in a full assessment process where the development has a potential for a strategic impact on the highways network. There is presumably a benchmark for that, a trigger in terms of numbers of units being proposed, some kind of trigger in terms of vehicle movements, for instance, in terms of modelling which has been done in relation to those applications. So, but from a layperson's point of view, I'm not aware what that trigger would be, and I would be very interested to know what that trigger is. So, where the definition is of the point at which any individual development has that potential for a strategic impact on the highways network, because obviously that's the question as to whether you engage in what Highways England would like, the full assessment process, or don't. And again, to go back to this issue about the cumulative effect of comparatively smaller sites in comparison to something like Dunton Hills in the town centre areas, where and when does a full assessment process take place, if it needs to take place? Does it take place at the beginning before any of those sites can be developed because of a cumulative impact, because cumulatively they will have a strategic effect? Or does it not take place because individually they won't have a strategic effect? And again, as far as I'm concerned, I've just got question marks. I'm not getting clarity on that. And I would obviously dearly love to have clarity, because it's a very important point. And if it's not got right, things fall apart very rapidly. And the movements of traffic and the functions of junctions and functions of roads in Brentwood and Shenfield town centres cease to work. So if there is a straightforward answer to that, I'd be very grateful if somebody could supply it.
Thank you very much, Mr. Minot. Mr. Barnes.
Thank you. Two very quick points. I'm just going to focus on policy B11. We do have an odd comment on policy B16, but that's all right. We'll leave that for later if you're comfortable with that as an approach. I think, unlike Mr. Warren, we have had a chance to discuss policy B11, and obviously from the F9A document, suggested change. It's quite a sensible change to put forward at this stage, and it's one that should be commended to take forward. Our only caveat is obviously one of it's a policy, and we just need to be careful, as Mr. Hollingworth said previously, that it needs to be seen within the context of Article 122 of the SIL regs. So no more, no less than that, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Barnes. Mr. Hollingworth, you had your hand up earlier, but it's not there now, is it?
I did, thank you, sir. No, it was actually to make the point that Mr. Warren already made previously, that the text that Mr. Shadarivian kindly explained to us this morning around the strategic sites, I don't believe it's included in the written material that was circulated this morning. But no, I completely take the point that there will be a main modifications consultation. I think perhaps I'm in danger of overly obsessing about the detail here. Fundamentally, as others have already said, I think we're there with the sound local plan, and we're into the matters of detail now. So no, so Mr. Warren, expect he made the comment I was going to make. So thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Hollingworth. Could I just picking up a number of points that have been raised and our own sort of seeking clarification. I wonder whether the council could just help us with how the proposed BE11 policy, the changed policy, and the wording about allocated development with local plan will provide reasonable and proportionate contribution to increase capacity. Don't need to look at the detailed wording, but can you just help us understand how that would apply to all the allocations, if it would? Would it apply to development proposals that came forward that are not allocations? And how does it relate to the proposed policy in relation to developer contributions?
I can address this in broad terms. Otherwise, I'm going to have to descend into dealing with detailed drafting, which I would rather avoid. B11 does refer to allocated development, and that is one of its weaknesses, because it ought to refer to allocated and other development that comes forward, so that where necessary, other developments not otherwise identified at this stage, which could conceivably have an impact, or therefore to share that burden. I think it's very difficult to see any major sites coming forward, however, which are not the subject of allocations. Most windfall sites are going to be quite small. So, and of course, the rest of the borough is green belt. Nothing more need be said about that. But nonetheless, I think the policy ought to be expanded to include the possibility of other sites coming forward and also having to meet, share the burden, if you like, of those costs. So what was the other point, sir?
There were two other points. One was in relation to whether this would apply to all sites or whether there was. This is a strategic policy. Yeah. Are we dealing with? Is there a threshold? And then how does that relate to the developer contributions policy as proposed by the council, as suggested by the council to be modified, which refers to the infrastructure development plan and has a little bit more detail in it.
It's important that the policy provides the foundation or the framework to require those contributions, particularly where at a plan level, the impact on the highway network, strategic highway network, will have an impact and therefore would require some interventions, as we've already discussed. But if an individual development is looked at on its own, it may be very difficult to establish the relationship between the intervention required and that development on its own. But of course, none of those developments could come forward without the requisite intervention on a more strategic level, whatever that intervention might be. So it's important that the policies provide a foundation for recovering the cost of providing the necessary infrastructure. The reference to reasonable and proportionate actually is merely to reflect the fact, one, that SIL regs require both the contributions to be necessary and reasonable, and proportionate is added here in order to contextualize the strategic approach, if you like, in that the costs will be shared on a proportionate basis, so having regard to the extent of the development which is being proposed and its relative contribution overall, having regard to its size.
And is the council satisfied then in respect of this? And we're dealing with proposed changes, I suppose suggested changes. The suggested changes to BE11, the infrastructure, the developer contribution policy, and the individual allocations. So it is totally clear for the owner of a site that is allocated what it is expected that they will need to contribute to.
That's the ambition. Whether or not the proposed informal changes in F9A achieve that is a matter which needs to be considered. And therefore, any further changes need to be considered in light of that objective. So you may consider that these informal suggestions don't do enough, and you will express that if we get to the stage when you think the plan can be made sound by modifications. If we get to that stage, then no doubt you will inform us as to and all interested parties as to what you think is required in order to make the plan sound by changes to individual policies. So this is intended, as it were, to provide you with a basis to consider that. If you think there are weaknesses, then those matters can be addressed through the modifications process.
Thank you, Mr.
On a formal basis, with proper consultation and input from all interested parties.
Thank you, Mr. Davian. Just a point. I know he's got his hand up, but I will just ask if the council can. And you may need to come back on it, but Mr. Minor asked about the reference to development close to schools, which is in the submitted policy, but which is not within the suggested modified BE11. And I just wonder whether there was anything there that could help us to deal with Mr. Minot's point?
I can't answer that now, but certainly I will give it consideration.
Thank you. Mrs. Wright.
Thank you. That was just one of the points I was going to raise. Obviously, we have discussed BE11 before under under the original Matter 12A, and this is a continuation of the discussions, and it was raised about the issues with the submitted policy, because the vast majority of the wording is set out as objectives, which is why that policy, we consider that policy is not sound, because it's not effective. So we recognise that there should be changes. How far those changes go, because obviously now we're discussing the policy in relation to highway matters. We have discussed an element of it in relation to public sustainable transport. So I suppose, again, it's the council just needs to go back to the original submitted policy as a potential option to just see actually how can we, because the change that's set out in F9A is quite a significant change, and I know some are supporting that change, and some are raising concerns about that change. So it would be worth us having understanding the council's way forward in actually addressing some of the concerns that have been raised today about this relating to all development. Because that doesn't seem to sit, I don't think, with other policies. I don't think it's consistent with some other policies. So if the council can just consider that, it could be something that we have to sort of, to consider a little bit more detail. So I'll leave it there for now.
I do understand the point you're making.
But with the potential local plan review policy, and has been already raised in the session as well, then there are implications of that on how far these policies actually need to go in relation to that, if there is an immediate review.
Yes, I understand that too.
Okay.
I understand the point also that my learned friend Mr. Warren is making. The long and the short of it is, if you should go down the route of finding the plan sound subject to modifications, and on the basis of an early review, I say if, the point is the early review will throw up another housing number based on the standard methodology. Moreover, there will be a need to identify more sites for development in accordance with a reassessed spatial strategy, depending upon what the call for sites throws up. And inevitably, therefore, it's going to engage Highways England and other stakeholders in detailed discussions about what further impacts will be and what interventions will be required, hopefully in the context of where we have two major infrastructure decisions in relation to both LTC and Junction 28 sorted, so we will know exactly then what the background growth is going to be, and therefore how much mitigation should be on the shoulders of this borough. So I perfectly understand that, and should you go down that route, then I will make sure that if we're looking at modifications, starting as it were from the deposit draft policy, rather than starting from the basis of F9A, that those points are fully taken into account, Ma'am.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. In terms of hands up wishing to speak, I've got Mr. Minot and then Mr. Walton and then Mr. Warren. So Mr. Minot.
Yes. Sorry, it takes time to come back on. Yes, just a couple of more points to make. One of which is, in fact, I'm very supportive, and I think a lot of residents would be very supportive of the interest, should I say, maybe that Mr. Shadrevian is expressing in terms of adding in non-allocated development to BE11, because particularly in areas where there are issues of cumulative impact of multiple sites, you're obviously in a straw that breaks the camel's back situation. Even though an individual windfall site coming forward may in itself not be particularly large, it may actually be, as things develop, the application which is clearly in danger of pushing a situation beyond the point where it's tenable. And therefore, I think it's, although obviously I'm taking on board what Ms. Wright is saying in terms of the issues about the relationship between that and other policies, I think from a sort of layperson's point of view, that would be a very welcome step to have that inclusion because of the way in which those effects could happen. So I thought I wanted to say that. The other thing I wanted to say is, I think it actually makes more sense to say it in relation to BE11 than BE16. And I'm not being facetious here, but there is a serious issue here. This evening, the council is going to have a process presented to it whereby we're being invited to join a joint committee under the heading of ASALA, the Association of South Essex Local Authorities. And everywhere in the documentation of that proposal, there is, as it were, the suggestion that in order for a whole series of strategic developments to take place and strategic improvements to transport infrastructure to take place, the council would absolutely need to be part of this ASALA joint committee. Now, the reason why I think it's relevant here is obviously because at the time this plan was submitted, this council was not a member of the ASALA joint committee. As we're speaking right now, it's still not a member of the ASALA joint committee. And if we are to take at face value what the council itself is saying in its own documentation for tonight's meeting, I would say the implication there is that there is a tacit suggestion that at the time the plan was submitted, the council could not deliver or would not be able to deliver the kind of strategic changes that are necessary, even in partnership with the other existing organisations, obviously Essex Highways, Highways England, etc., and in dialogue with them. Because the way the ASALA proposal that's coming this evening is being presented to us is this is the way to do it, and that's why this is such a great proposal from the point of view of those who are proposing it. So that might come across as a somewhat facetious, and it's obviously there's different modes of speech here, but when one sees both of these things being said, when one sits in both of these forums, one can't help but cross-reference. And it struck me very forcibly that there was an issue there. Either the council being part of the ASALA joint committee is crucial to all of this, but it hasn't yet been mentioned anywhere in any of the local plan documents, or it's not crucial, and in which case the ASALA joint committee proposal, the claims that are being made in it by the council are essentially null and void, because everything is fine and all of these things could have been delivered without council involvement in that process. So I just thought particularly given that it's going on later on today, it's worth mentioning it at this stage.
Thank you very much, Mr. Minot. Mr. Walkden, please.
Thank you, sir. Just a point about policy B11, which says that mitigation will be for transport infrastructure, strategic infrastructure within the borough itself. It's just a point that the mitigation shouldn't actually stop at the borough boundary. In this case, particularly junctions 28 and 29 of the M25, parts of them actually lie outside the borough of Brentwood, and it is likely that they will be significantly impacted by the plan itself. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Walkden. Okay. Mr. Warren, please.
Thank you, sir. I just have a question about, again, process really. Is it intended, sir, to have a session? I don't anticipate it is, looking at the latest timetable on the immediate review idea, because as I understand it, that's part of your consideration as to whether that should be a main modification to make the plan sound, if so, in what form, etc. So how may I ask how that is proposed to be dealt with procedurally?
We're not intending to have a session. That is a matter that, as inspectors, is within our consideration if we feel that kind of approach is necessary to make the plan sound. I'll bring in Mrs. Wright here, who's got her hand up as well, who might be able to assist further.
Thank you, Mr. Warden. The suggested policy that's been suggested by the council should have been circulated, so you should have a copy of it. That's what I've got a copy.
We've got a copy, ma'am, of the suggested wording with, I think, 4 different sections, and some referring, including to highways infrastructure improvement. My question was really about how and when that is to be debated, because obviously there are some highways points in there, but there's a general point about whether it's necessary to make the plan sound to have it. And I just wondered how.
Well, I'm not going to expand on what Mr. Warden said. Mr. Warden has said it quite eloquently, that it is within our remit to make that decision if we feel it's necessary, having considered and listened to all of the evidence that we've had. We have provided it just for politeness, really, because that's what's been put in front of us so far. Now, it has been suggested, and we've suggested through the hearing sessions, that there could be a potential local plan review policy, and the council has previously produced a very simple review policy that was very draft and suggested by themselves, and ourselves as inspectors sent the council a suggestion from another policy that had been put forward, because if we go down that route of a review policy, and if this plan goes forward, then that is likely, because that's the way that this plan needs to go forward, then it has to be a tight policy in relation to the key strategic issues that are now outstanding. And we had the discussion yesterday in relation to the key outstanding strategic transport issues. So those would need to be in the policy. And obviously there is the consideration of objectively assessed housing needs, what we're terming the unmet needs, because that's only recently been highlighted back in March.
Yes.
So we, as the inspectors, have to consider which is the best way to progress. Is it to delay the plan for a significant period of time? Because it wouldn't be several months. It could be a long, long time. Or do we move forward and try and have a mechanism to ensure that something is put in place to try and see if there is a way forward on the plan? So myself and my colleague would need to have a discussion about, we're not planning on having any further sessions. Now, that doesn't mean that we can't change our mind subject to what we hear, but we're not at the moment planning to have any more further sessions than those that are set out for this week.
No.
If we as the inspectors decide that we do consider that the plan could move forward subject to an immediate review policy or early review policy, then that would be up to ourselves to decide whether we wanted to put that in. as Mr. Warden has indicated. Whether we decide that we would like to have comments on it, that's something that we will discuss.
Yes.
If we did want comments, we probably would not hold further sessions. We can do things through written representations. We don't have to hold sessions, obviously. So
No.
we may well go down that route, but I can't say at the moment. I would need to speak to my colleague in more detail about that.
No,
But thank you for raising it.
No, thank you, ma'am. And don't get me wrong, I totally appreciate everything that you've said. Because you and Mr. Warden are going to be deciding whether or not it's the way to go, if you like, to have an immediate review policy. Obviously, that may have substantial consequences, and it may impact, obviously, on the soundness of the plan, if that's a policy that's required to make the plan sound. It may affect some of these points about cumulative impact and effective delivery of the bigger sites. For instance, just thinking on today's topic about how you divide up the costs. And so all I'd suggest, ma'am, for your consideration, a request actually, is that you do allow representatives to, in writing, I absolutely take your point about unnecessary to have a hearing and have us all say these points. We can write them to you, where interested parties address you briefly on the principle of having a review policy. The details, I suspect, you and the council, etc., will consider between you. But the principle seems to me to be pretty important overall, and it would be fair and I think helpful, ma'am, to afford parties at least some opportunity to comment on it before you make the decision in principle.
Thank you. We'll certainly take your comments on board. Thank you.
Thank you very much, ma'am.
Thank you, Mr. Ward.
Thank you, Mrs. Wright. Ms. Webster, you had your hand up. I see it's gone down. Did you wish to come in and make a point?
No, really, I think Mr. Minot covered all the things that were probably in my mind, so I didn't need to make further comment.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Warren, you've got your hand up. Is that just left over from before? Thank you.
Thanks.
Mr. Show-David, is there anything that the council wishes to come back on in relation to policy BE11? I've heard the points that you've heard just now.
No, and I'm grateful for everyone's contribution, and I'm alert to the points they've made. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm wanting to move on to policy BE16, but I'm conscious that we are due a break. So I'm suggesting that we have a break now and then come back and deal with policy BE16, and then we shall finish transport and then move on to air quality. So it's now 10 to 11. So if we return back here at 11:05, and then we shall finish transport and then move on to air quality. Okay. Thank you very much. Okay, welcome back, everybody. What I'm proposing to do now is move on to policy BE16, which is we've just touched on briefly, and I am aware that not everyone has seen the wording that was it suggested amendment to the proposed changes that the Highways England have suggested following our discussion yesterday as a suggestion as a way of overcoming their objection on soundness. And so Ms. Feeney is, I think, going to circulate that now to everybody. Mr. Sharadavian did read it out earlier, which was helpful, but hopefully people should be receiving that additional wording suggestion. Can Ms. Feeney, are you able to just confirm that is the case? That is being circulated?
It's just I'm putting my last name in the CC, and it's just been sent. It'll be with people in the next minute or so.
Thank you. So hopefully that will assist participants whilst we're looking at it. The wording, as Mr. Sharadavian has suggested, has read out, is that the words "and engage in a full assessment process with Highways England where development has potential for material impact on the strategic road network." So whilst that is being circulated and people have a chance to look at that wording, can I invite Highways England to just explain their thinking in relation to that suggested wording, and how that might operate, and how it is a potential way of overcoming the Highways England's concerns about soundness. I don't know whether Mr. Wharton is able to, or Burgess is able to help us here.
Yes, thank you. So can I just invite Mr. Wharton to respond to that question, please?
Thank you.
Yes, thank you. Highways England deal with planning applications and local plans in accordance with NPPF and DFT Circular 02/2013. And the circular basically says that if there is an adopted local plan, subsequent planning applications are easier to accept. You know, in practice, if there is mitigation for a local plan, if there's an adopted local plan, then planning applications that are subsequent to that and part of that local plan can be waved through, and it's quite an easy process from our point of view. In this case, there is likely to be an adopted plan, but no mitigation, and therefore we want comfort in the wording of the policies that states that we can still engage in the planning process. We can still review planning applications as they come along in the absence of agreed mitigation for an adopted plan. So that is the reasoning why we are looking for wording within the plan which allows us to do that. Thank you.
Thank you. And is there a threshold level to which that particular approach would apply?
There isn't. No, it's with any planning application that comes along, it's up to the planning authority to decide whether it's likely to be a concern to Highways England or not. If you start applying thresholds without an assessment, it may impair your ability to respond to potentially to planning applications that could potentially have an impact. You could miss planning applications, if you understand my meaning, because you've sort of screened them out. You never really know whether a planning application is going to have an impact or not until you do some assessment, until you look at the trips generated and the origins and the destinations of those trips. You just don't know where they're going to, what impact they're going to have on your network. So to apply a threshold may be counterintuitive. What I can say is that it is unlikely that smaller developments, for example, developments of less than 50 households or so, are likely to have an impact on our network from either an operational or a safety point of view. But I think it is unwise to apply specific thresholds for the reasons that I've just given you. Thank you.
So if, because the policy as suggested before your suggestion refers to the submission of transport assessments. So those transport assessments would not apply to every site, would they? They'd only is there a threshold on the submission of transport assessments generally that the council would expect?
There is no set national guidance on transport assessments anymore, because small sites can have an impact just that isn't acceptable, just as large sites can. I suppose that, you know, smaller sites, as I said, smaller sites are unlikely to have an impact, but it's not guaranteed. We normally go through a sort of triaging process ourselves. We don't review everything that comes in from a planning authority. You know, we consider the size of the development and the location, and you know, a lot of the time we can just decide as planning applications come in that, you know, we're not going to object to it, and it's not worth reviewing it. But you know, obviously we would like to have the option of doing that rather than having it decided for us through a threshold agreement beforehand.
And so would every planning application in Brentwood come across your desk? No, we receive the planning applications that the planning authority think may be of interest to us. Right. So in terms of so this is really about, is it, just let me understand that where transport assessments are prepared and submitted, in some of those cases it might be that Highways England want more detailed engagement in relation to the preparation of those specific transport assessments, because there might be a potential impact on the strategic road network.
Yes, that's correct.
Okay. Thank you. Does the council wish to say add anything to what Mr. Walton has said, and then I'll invite any other participants to make comments.
Just a couple of points. Without going over what was discussed yesterday, the wording as proposed here seems to me acceptable, subject to the expression has a potential for material impact, because of course that could embrace any number of developments, including minor developments, because that potential exists. So it's much better for it to be expressed as where development will have a likely material impact on the strategic road network, so that we don't have to engage developers and promoters in very expensive exercises, which will slow down the realization of housing if we were to engage in lengthy and protracted discussions in relation to impacts and necessary infrastructure requirements associated with those impacts. So will be likely to have is a better formulation, in my view.
Thank you. As inspectors in listening to people's comments on this wording, then we will, if we think it is appropriate, take into account what's been said and look at that wording in terms of how that policy best may work. Are there any other part, Miss Webster? Would you like to comment?
Obviously, this is probably a more technical question you've got between language, but I understand the two standpoints of Mr. Shadovarian and Mr. Walkden. But my concern probably, on balance, listening to Mr. Walkden's comments about the proposed council suggestion of making it likely, is that I don't understand quite how who would be then doing that evaluation of likely, because it could be that the wrong people are doing that evaluation and they may not be best placed. So living in an area where we have that risk and we have the problem that was talked about earlier of cumulative problems and potentially smallish sites actually creating transport problems, I actually feel uncomfortable that the council office is deciding on what's likely or not when it should be highways, the highways office that really is probably better able to evaluate that.
Thank you, Ms. Webster. Mr. Hollingsworth, sorry.
Thank you, sir. Just had several comments to make on this and having opportunity to discuss with my client in the break as well. The first point we wish to make is that whilst we appreciate there will be consultation on main modifications in due course, and I entirely understand what Mr. Shadarivian is saying about these not being necessarily finalised modifications, we do feel it's important that there is effective opportunity to comment on these detailed changes, because they will have consequences for proposed allocated sites, and by effective opportunity to comment. I think we're looking at something ahead of a main modifications, which is normally right at the very end of the process, and by which point decisions on soundness have effectively been reached. That was our first sort of overarching point, if you like, sir. Our second was in terms of this wording proposed, and I'm grateful for this feeling. I have received it a moment ago. But so initial comments on that. I think firstly we're not clear what is meant by a full assessment and how a decision maker would respond to that in due course. Again, this might be something that can be clarified through further main modifications, potentially even to supporting text. And secondly, sort of a wider concern that this could potentially, as the policy rather the main modifications is presently articulated, could be used to frustrate the delivery of sites that are proposed to be allocated. I think because of that slight ambiguity. But in reality, so to come back to our first point, that we do feel that we need an opportunity to comment on this at an effective stage in the process, where we've had opportunity to digest some of these proposed modifications more fully. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Hollingworth. I'll invite Mr. Watson to come back on that point in a moment, but Mr. Barnes first, and then Mr. Warren.
The word "full" means in those terms. Mr. Axon is happy to elaborate on that any further if you wish for that. I think the wording of the policy itself, it's in the first paragraph. Actually, would like to pick something up. Is that would it not be better to adopt the words or the wording or the text from paragraph 109 of the July 2019 version of the framework, rather than have unacceptable applying to highway safety and congestion? The wording in the framework is unacceptable highway safety and severe cumulative severe effect in relation to congestion. I'm just wondering why we need just to rewrite that point and just to simplify it back. I don't think that would be a controversial change to make at all. Just to say, again, I'll just reiterate, with the opportunity of being able to look at the policy today, we think there has been this opportunity to have effective consultation with my clients at least, and my transport consultants to be able to understand what the implications are. So I don't think a further session is necessary.
Thank you, Mr. Barnes. Mr. Warren.
Sorry, can I just come in just for a minute? Can I just ask for clarification on the paragraph number? Because paragraph 109,
Okay.
it's the wrong one. That's lorry parking.
Oh, sorry, that's my fault. It's 111 of the new bit.
111, right? Okay,
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you.
Mr. Warren.
Thank you, sir. My comment on behalf of Tesco really stems from Mr. Walkden's evidence to you a few minutes ago about the purpose of their suggested changes to B16. So mitigation normally in the local plan, here adopted plan and no mitigation. Now that may be an overstatement to some degree, but no overall, as it were, as I understand it, settled mitigation scheme at the moment. The question surely, sir, for your and Ms. Wright's consideration is whether we should have a plan adopted without mitigation being set out in the plan, even for the allocated sites. I think that's obviously the first question, bearing in mind what the framework has said in its various different paragraph numbers since 2012 about strategic policies making provision for infrastructure, including transport infrastructure, within the plan itself. Now, I think paragraph 20B in the latest version of the framework, because there are cumulative issues, which Tesco, as you know, interested in the site, not in the plan at the moment, but maybe one of the smaller ones that would be caught up in this debate about overall cumulative impacts is keenly interested in. And I can see that there is an issue about sites' cumulative impacts and sites falling below the radar potentially, and how that's going to be dealt with. And the only other point on this, sir, is that, again, this is an issue which engages the question as to whether to have an immediate review, and if so, how that should be framed, because there are obviously infrastructure consequences of having an adopted plan with the kind of policy HE is promoting, and at the same time as the big sites start to rumble forward, if I can put it that way, more sites coming forward through an immediate review. How does that affect how much people are paying and when and so on? So it is a point, I think, which you and Ms. Wright will no doubt consider when you're thinking about the immediate review policy as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Warren. Mr. Minor.
I'm so sorry,
Mr. Sorry.
Forgive me for intervening. I'd just like to come back on something my learned friend mentioned here.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Just while we're on the point, and I'm looking at the new MPPF. Paragraph 20 does indeed say that strategic policies should set out an overall strategy for the pattern, scale and design of places and make sufficient provision for infrastructure. We know that in January, the IDP has identified strategic solutions to the strategic highways that need improving as a result of planned growth. Since then, and taking into account new data from the LTC modelling, that has been under review. We know essentially that there are solutions. There is disagreement at the moment with the agency in relation, with Highways England in relation to detailed design issues. But we can be confident at the plan level that there are solutions, cost-effective solutions, which have been costed as part of the infrastructure delivery plan, which will be kept under review. So there's no doubt about that. Just to make that point.
Thank you much, Mr. Davian. Mr. Minot.
Yes, thank you. Camera, come on. Yes. So I think, we go back to the questions that have already been asked. I'm very grateful to Mr. Walkden for the information that he's providing. Obviously, as a layperson, one doesn't have an understanding of how these processes are working, and it sometimes is a little bit difficult to work out whether it's your own lack of understanding as a lay person, or whether there's a genuine lack of a system or lack of an obvious process which all local authorities would follow and would be followed in all cases. In this case, I mean, there's a sort of a rephrasing of Ms. Webster's question about who is assessing the likeliness of the impact. I mean, I think that my question here really is where does the onus lie? Mr. Walkden is telling us that it's not the Highways Authority who's deciding what the threshold level, which triggers the issue, that triggers the Highways Authority's involvement is. It's up to the Planning Authority to decide. We know that in this day and age, local authorities, as with everybody else, have extremely limited resources. I've got real questions in terms of resource capacity for the local authority to be monitoring all of the cumulative effects of particularly this business of a multiplicity of sites, and making the decision as to when the issue is triggered, as it were, that when there is a material impact on the strategic network. Obviously, it can't be the developers, because the developers are always going to be seeking to underplay the impact of their own applications, and one understands that entirely. So I've kind of got a question really to Mr. Walkden in terms of, because clearly this can't be unique to Brentwood, this business of cumulative impact and how that's being assessed. It would be useful, I think, to know what kind of process operates in other places, and what role the Highways Authority has in keeping a finger on the pulse of it. You know, understanding how things are totting up and where the intervention or where the threshold is being met. But also going back to the points that I've previously made about the council and what one does and doesn't see in the council's own documentation. I mean, I'm asking myself the question is whether the council has a threshold on the cumulative impact of multiple sites, because I haven't seen any documentation anywhere that suggests that. I mean, I think Mr. Walkden's point about there's a potential danger with having a threshold. If you state the threshold explicitly, then something may fall very slightly short of that threshold. And if you've stated the threshold, that means you don't get yourself involved. But in fact, the threshold is effectively met, and therefore the threshold can become an obstacle to the right approach and the right response. I understand that. This is not about demanding that there should be a threshold, but it's this question about where the onus of responsibility lies and who is assessing the threshold. And actually, I think I'm somewhat grateful to Mr. Warren for effectively reminding me of the Tesco's site, because I think that's a perfect demonstration. I know we're not going to talk about individual sites, but in terms of the point that Mr. Shadrevian made earlier on in relation to the windfall sites being likely to be relatively small, although Mr. Warren refers to the Tesco's site as one of the smaller ones, it's obviously small in relation to something like Dunton Hills. But in terms of a town centre site, it would be a very major site. It is not on the list. Obviously, if that was to come forward, the council needs to have policies in the plan which are triggered by an application of that size coming forward in the town centre. But it also, again, goes back to this point about cumulative impact. If a site which is coming forward of that scale in the town centre, which puts pressure on exactly the same roads, exactly the same junctions as a number of sites which are in the local plan, which are being proposed, which in my view already put unnecessarily high pressure on those roads and junctions, comes forward, that has to trigger the process. That has to trigger something. If it doesn't, we're in extremely dangerous situation. So that has to be the case. But again, just to reiterate, where does the onus lie? If I understand what Mr. Walkden's saying, and I'm not saying the Highways England have that responsibility, I'd be interested in what any response he might have to what I've just asked. But I'm effectively also asking the question of the council in terms of thresholds, and what if there isn't a threshold, what process the council has in mind, and as it were can guarantee that it has the resources to put in place and to actually realise in the real world, is there for keeping its finger on the pulse, working out the cumulative effect of numerous applications which are coming in and all having a small effect, and eventually saying, right, this is the point when all of this has to be assessed. Or if it's not being done that way, to say before any of those sites come forward, and bearing in mind we've already got sites which are in the proposed plan which are actually coming forward. I mean, we just had a planning meeting last night. There was a presentation 2 weeks ago, at which point it looked like that would actually come to the planning meeting last night. So we're already at the point where sites are coming forward. Doesn't all of this assessment and all of this concern about the need for mitigation and the potential impact, real world impact on the strategic highways network have to be assessed at this point before any of them have come along? So effectively 2 questions. I'm sorry for, as usual, bumbling on and on, but they're effectively 2 questions, and I think they're crucial ones.
Thank you, Mr. Minot. Obviously, we're dealing with matters of principle here, and the wording has been suggested, but we're not looking at every minute part of that wording here now. And also, Highways England's responsibility lies solely in relation to the strategic impact on the strategic road network, and not to be confused with the highway authority that would deal with other highways matters across the borough. But I wonder whether, Mr. Walton, was anything you wish to say in relation to what you've heard. But I've got a particular point that I just would be interested in hearing what Highways England mean by a full assessment process.
Thank you. Yes. Yes, I did pick up on what Mr. Hollingworth said earlier. I think the word full might be better expressed by using the term appropriate. We're not looking for the same assessment for a small site as we are for a large site. You know, an assessment needs to be proportionate to the likely impact. So, you know, for a small assessment, we may simply be able to look at the number of vehicles travelling through a junction and dismiss it as not likely to have any impact at all. Whereas for a larger site, which has a lot of trips through a junction, you know, we need a full assessment. We need junction modelling. We do need merge and diverge assessments in order to establish the full impacts. So I think the word full could be replaced with, you know, an appropriate assessment in agreement with Highways England. That would be acceptable to us.
Thank you, Mr. Walton. Thank you. I want to draw transport discussion to a close now, and I'm just wanting to know whether any participant has any other point that they wish to make to help others as inspectors before we leave transport. Mrs. Wright.
Thank you. Just before we leave that particular point, I just want it made clear to me, because I'm still a little bit confused. The additional wording to that particular part of BE16. Now, there are thresholds, because the thresholds are set out in the County Council's Development Management Policies document. That relates to transport assessments and transport statements, and that's made very clear in the document. Although the document is 10 years old, it is 2011, so I don't know whether the County Council has any concerns or issues around the age of that document, or whether there's no, and I'm thinking about updates to national policy, whether it be transport related policy or planning policy, whether there are any implications on that. So I would like to hear from the County Council just on the age of their development management policies document, because that's clearly set out in the policy, those are the thresholds that will be used, are those that are set out in this document, and the Appendix B of the County Council's document clearly sets out when a transport statement or a TA, a transport assessment, would be required. So that's clear to me. So is this additional element that Highways England is stating, is that in relation to those developments that would need to produce transport assessments and or statements, therefore there would be a threshold, or is this to all development? So it's an addition above and beyond the transport assessment and transport statement. So for instance, for residential, the minimum threshold for transport statement is 25 dwellings. So anything under that wouldn't be required to do a transport statement, for instance. So I just want clarification. Is Highways England wanting to engage, and I know we've had an appropriate level of engagement, an appropriate assessment. I know we've gone down that route of discussing some more wording there. But can I just be clear? Is Highways England wanting to see all proposals, and on the proviso that either the wording is has a potential for material impact or will have a likely material impact, or is it in relation to the thresholds that are set out in the County Council's document? Because that's not clear from the wording. So it'd be useful for me to just understand from Highways England's point of view what exactly you would like, and then if the County Council can clarify that their thresholds still stand, even though they're 10 years old, but nothing has changed. I just want clarification on that. So if I could start, maybe Mr. Walkden, if you can just clarify that point.
Yes.
Please.
In terms of the thresholds that you quote, they are likely to cover the vast majority of circumstances which we would need to consider. There are certain cases which may fall through the net from a safety point of view. I mean, in principle, you can have a safety impact, a severe safety impact on a network, with just a few vehicles, if the network itself is under severe pressure in the first place. So those thresholds that you have are to cover more operational impacts than safety impacts, and there may be some developments that do have safety impacts that would fall through the net if we weren't looking for separate wording within policy B16.
So the wording in B16 maybe just needs to be tinkered a little bit to just make it clear that it's not in relation to sites that are proposed to submit transport statements or transport assessments, because as you said, there are some sites that may come under those thresholds and therefore wouldn't come in that element. So I just want it made clear. So thank you for that clarity. If we can let we'll have a look at that wording and see whether that's now I understand what you would like, then we can have a look at that wording. Can I just bring in Mr. Robinson, please, to just clarify the point I've made about the actual development management policies? If you can just explain their standing, their status, and they're 10 years old, but are the thresholds still absolutely relevant?
Thanks. They're the current thresholds. They may be subject to review soon, but the policy, I believe, refers to the development management policies or its successors.
It does.
So I think it's covered. If they are replaced, then the new threshold would apply.
Okay. Great. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Warden.
Thank you very much, Mr. Wright, Mr. Robinson. Mr. Thone, thank you.
Sorry, I've clicked the wrong button. I think there is an issue here about what I will call local knowledge when this comes up. Yes, have standard thresholds, etc. But if consultees, such as parish councils, are concerned about something like a transport problem caused by a development, would it not be possible to word the document such that if there is a parish council or some other organisation raises concerns, that can adjust the threshold. In other words, the threshold might say 50 houses, but if a parish council is concerned about it, it still goes into that threshold. I think that would probably be, from a practical perspective of getting the right outcome for a local area, a way of dealing with it. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Phone. Mr. Axon.
Thank you, sir. Just before we close this session, very short point, and just in case you hadn't spotted it, I just want to bring to your attention the government's direction of travel on matters such as this. For instance, in the document that they issued last week, the DfT document Decarbonising Transport, a Better Greener Britain, two passages, sir, that I just might draw to your attention. One on page 158, saying we need to move away from transport planning based on predicting future demand to provide capacity, open brackets, predict and provide, to planning that sets an outcome communities want to achieve and provides the transport solutions to deliver those outcomes, in brackets, vision and validate. That's what the government is advising at page 158. And at page 6 of that document, it relates back to COVID, and it says, as we build back from the pandemic, it will be essential to avoid a car-led recovery. I'll just bring those to your attention, sir, just in case you weren't aware. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Axon. Thank you. Are there any other points on strategic transport insofar as they relate to highway matters before we move off this? No. Is there anything that the council wishes to say finally in relation to transport? Well, Mr. Phone, you've got your hand up. Is that? Thank you.
Sorry,
Mr. Shardavian.
Unclick it.
Thank you, Mr. Shardavian.
No,
thank you. Okay, thank you very much. So we shall take a short break now for 10 minutes. Well, let's resume back at 5 to 12, and we shall then deal with air quality. So I'd just like to say thank you to all those participants who are not staying on for air quality for their contributions this morning. Thank you.
Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. We'll now move on, subject to everybody being back in the room. We'll now move on to discuss air quality. Great, thank you. Now, I know there were limited participants for this session. I think, Mr. Minot, you had some queries raised, and is there anybody else who, I know there may be others sitting in just observing, but are there others who are participating in this discussion, just so that I'm aware? Or are you going to keep your cards close to your chest for now and then jump in? Mr. Warren, please.
I wasn't going to put it quite like that, man, but yes. We haven't
see what's said,
chest,
and then jump in.
If something crops up,
that's
then
fine.
Yeah. Thank you.
That's absolutely fine. No worries. Thank you. Thank you for letting me know, Mr. Warren. What I wanted to do is just go back to our actual MIQs on air quality. Now, obviously, they were part of Matter 13E, which seems like a long time ago now. But we didn't discuss these because we did have an initial discussion, and then there was a realisation that the council just needed to go away and at a local plan level carry out an air quality sort of report to just be able to answer some of the questions that we had. Now, I've obviously read your document F138, which is the air quality modelling report that has been recently produced, excuse me, at the on the 8th of July. That was it's dated the 8th of July and has been circulated to all participants that are in this session, and that is relevant to representations that have been made. I've read that report. I'm not necessarily proposing to go through that. Obviously, the aim, and I will just summarise my understanding. So by all means, then, if the council wants to come in and explain anything further, the aim was obviously to ascertain whether or not local plan development has potential to cause air quality issues, which is obviously of particular concern. And it's obviously an agreed matter. It's set out in all the evidence that the majority of issues relating to air quality in Brentwood are in relation to traffic exhaust emissions. So I think that's very clear. I think it would just be very useful so Mr. Williams, have you been one of the authors of the report? Are you here on that basis? Yes, brilliant. Great, thank you. It would be really useful for you to just summarise the key conclusions that have come out of it. If there are issues around how and people have questions about how the assessment has been carried out, I'll let those people come in and ask those particular questions. But it would be quite pertinent to just understand, for everybody in the room, the specifics, summary, key points of what's come out of the actual assessment.
Sure.
Thank you.
Okay. So Brentwood has 3 air quality management areas, and it carries out monitoring every year. Monitoring, so those air quality management areas are set out because of high levels of NO2 due to traffic. Monitoring has shown air quality improving year on year in the air quality management areas and throughout the rest of the borough. We carried out modelling for 2019 as a base year for comparison with the monitoring data that we have, and then also projected emissions to 2033 for a baseline and for with local plan development scenario. So modelling for 2019 showed there were exceedances of the NO2 standard along kind of the major roads in Brentwood and also at Wilson's Corner, and exceedances for the particulate standards along the M25 and A12. Once we go forward to 2033, we have an increase in traffic flows, but we also have reduction in vehicle emissions due to improved vehicle technology. This shows that the modelling has then shown that the NO2 concentrations decrease significantly by then and are well below the air quality standards throughout the borough. Particulate concentrations are not affected as much because by that stage the bulk of emissions are actually from non-exhaust, so from brake and tyre wear and road wear emissions rather than from exhaust emissions. So particulate concentrations are predicted to decrease away from the road and remain roughly constant at roadside locations between now and 2033. Comparing the 2033 baseline and the local plan scenario shows there are increases in NO2 concentrations along the major roads and around the major development sites, but they still remain well below the air quality standards. There are increases in particulate concentrations along the major roads, and there remain some exceedances of the standard, but they're restricted to immediately adjacent to the major roads and don't extend to any residential properties. We assessed the significance of those changes using Institute of Air Quality Management significance criteria, which use both the change in concentration and also the overall magnitude of concentration to assess how significant they are. And that assessment concluded that all the changes in concentrations were negligible.
Thank you. Thank you for that summary. I think that's been really useful to just provide some clarity in the meeting so that everybody understands what your report has produced. So in relation to air quality then, and I'm just referring to some of the MIQ questions that we had, because the conclusion is based on the evidence and the assessment that you carried out, that because the change overall is negligible, then is there any necessity for any particular mitigation or anything like that to be set out to ensure that nothing goes beyond the expectations of what is forecast from your perspective? And then obviously I can ask the council, but from your perspective as the author of the report, because something says it's negligible, is there anything that needs to be put in place to ensure that that negligible situation actually occurs? Or is it no, that's what's going to come forward through the planned growth, and we don't see any need for any particular mitigation in any particular locations? Or is that not part of your report? That's not something that you assessed?
It's not part of our report, but as you say, the impact is considered to be negligible. So we wouldn't expect any additional mitigation to be required. However, we would expect any significant developments to undertake their own air quality assessment. We were using fairly broad brush data. We don't know exactly what the developments are or where they are. So we've used the traffic data we've provided, but local issues could bring about air quality. Local developments could bring about air quality issues which are not part of this data. So we would expect any significant developments to have an air quality assessment carried out to address these issues specifically.
Yeah, I'm fully aware this is a high level local plan borough wide assessment, and that's what was asked for. It's not getting down to the specifics because that would be dealt with at planning application stage. Council, is there anything you want to, I will bring in Mr. Minot in a moment, but is there anything you want to add to what Mr. Williams has just said from the council's perspective at the broad level, because that sort of is in response to our question 192. And then I'm going to move on to a bit more specific, which Mr. Williams may not be able to assist, but the council may be able to assist on the other questions. So is there anything further you want to add that what Mr. Williams has said?
No, thank you, Mark.
Okay. Mr. Minot, do you want to come in now and give me your comments? But I am then going to be moving on to question 193, which talks more about the Southern Growth Corridor and the impacts of growth along that corridor and in relation to air quality. But Mr. Minot, if you want to give me your comments now.
Yeah. Yes, thanks for that. I've had a good read of F138, and I've got problems with that as a document. Certainly not meaning to cast any aspersions on CERC or Mr. Williams. It strikes me as, I mean, there's a lot of very detailed work. There's obviously, it's a very technical area, but it does strike me as being a somewhat airtight document. And I'm not, trying to play with words here. Once you're in the world of modelling, and there's accepted models, and you plug the figures in and you do all the right things, and then you get down into impressive detail, I have to say, in terms of the way in which the roughness of surfaces can affect things and canyon effects and things like this. It's an impressive level of detail. That's all brilliant, but it's all brilliant within its own airtight system. It's a notional world. It's a world of modelling. I kind of start off with questions, really, because there are things which strike me, and I might be just being misled by things I've seen and heard and getting the wrong end of the stick. But there are things that I don't quite understand about some of the air quality statements which are being made, both in this document and elsewhere. One of them is the basic statement, which is not unique to this document, this business of the air quality, quote unquote, improving year on year. If you actually look at table 4.1 in F138, I need to write it down on this side because I'll forget it. It's quite interesting. There are a list of sites where the concentrations actually increased between 2018 and 2019. There were 12 of those sites in all, of which I think there are at least 5 which are in the town centre. There's also another list of sites of which I think there are 7, all but one of which are very much in the town centre, what I would describe as being the town centre, the wider town centre, where the concentrations were more or less identical between 2018 and 2019. So no clear direction of, the numbers are so close together, you've got no clear direction of travel between those 2 years. And so overall, that means there are 19 of the BRW sites where either the numbers, the concentrations which are being measured, and this is all NO2, of course, the concentrations which are being measured are either increasing or staying more or less the same. And obviously, that's more than half of the 33 sites which are listed overall. So I think I would raise a query as to whether it's arguable from a table like that to simply say that the air quality is improving year on year. We also then get onto the question of the particulate matter pollution. And obviously, if you go back to F18A, we were told in F18A, paragraph 2.3, that Brentwood does not monitor particulate matter 2.5 concentrations. We're obviously in F138, we've got particulate matter 2.5, and we've also got particulate matter 10. Now, it may simply be my misunderstanding. The impression that I got from what is being said in F18A is that those concentrations of the particulate matter levels haven't been measured. And I'm struck by the fact that if you look through F138, there is not a table equivalent to table 4.1, which shows concentrations measured at the BRW sites for particulate matter 2.5 and particulate matter 10. So that implicitly suggests that there isn't an actual monitoring database for 2018, 2019 as there is for NO2, and that the diagrams which appear later in F138 are extrapolated in some manner, but F138 doesn't seem to explain how that's extrapolated. So I might be wrong about that. So that's effectively a question. I mean, maybe it would be appropriate for me to stop at this point and for some responses to that.
I was going to suggest that if we do that, because that may assist you in terms of your additional questions or whatever, or your additional discussion. So Mr. Williams, could you respond to that point?
So the first point was about decreases over time, and perhaps the table in the air quality document should have gone back a bit. There are variations year to year, but if you look at data for previous years, say look at the council's own air quality status reports, you'll see if you go back to 2016, the concentrations have decreased at nearly every site between 2016 and 2019. So while there is a bit of variability, you might get some increases at some sites for certain years, the long-term trend is a downward. So rather than saying year on year, the long-term trend is slightly downwards. So that's probably a better way of putting it than year on year decreases. You might get occasional increases from one year to the next, and they might be due to local issues, which were not part of a long-term trend. And the second issue was about particulate matter and the monitoring and modelling of that. The NO2 monitoring that's carried out is undertaken by diffusion tubes, which there's two kinds of monitoring. There's continuous monitors and diffusion tubes. Continuous monitors are the most accurate kind of monitors, but they are very expensive, and some local authorities have none, others may have one or two, but they're not something you're going to have tens of in a local authority. So the majority of local authorities carry out a lot of diffusion tube monitoring for NO2. It's not quite as robust, but it does give you a good assessment of where you're likely to be getting exceedances of the standard and ideas about long-term trends. Unfortunately, it's not possible to measure particulate matter using these diffusion tubes, which is why there's much less monitoring of particulate matter in Brentwood and in all local authorities. You need one of the big expensive boxes that measure air quality, and it's only practical to have one or two in a local authority. In terms of the modelling itself, the way the modelling works is we don't use the measured data in the model itself. We carry out the modelling and then compare our model results with measured data. So we do that for NO2 because we have the measured data, and we carry out an iterative process to refine our model so that we get as good agreement as we can. We do that for NO2 because we have the data. We don't have the data for PM10, but emissions behave in the same way, whether they're particulates or nitrogen dioxide, so they disperse in the same way. So the majority of assumptions that we make in the model apply equally to NO2 and PM10 and PM2.5. So basically we do as good as we can for PM10 and PM2.5 without any monitoring data to robustly verify it, but we have verified for the NO2 and the majority of assumptions are the same for both of them.
Shall I just come back? So one of the points about so one of the points about grateful again for the explanation in relation to the monitoring and the modelling, and I think I got that from the report. I think it was quite clear. Section 7 says there is some under prediction of NO2 concentrations along Brentwood High Street. 7 monitoring sites, the modelled concentrations range between 78% and 101% of measured values. It also strikes me when looking at the diagrams in that report that there are some similar problems of undermodelling either side of the A12, where you've got, I mean, I think of it in borough ward terms, it's Brentwood North / Pilgrim's Hatch, and obviously that's another area of interest in relation to the local plan, because you have two site policies for an area and extremely close to that. So that's the effect of the A12 there is one of the issues from my point of view in terms of air quality. But I was actually struck when you look at the three highest measured values in terms of this relationship between measured and modelling. The three highest measured values are at BRW5, BRW40 and BRW41, and the modelling in all cases only assessed that at 80 something or other % of the reality. So in all of the highest cases, the modelling was essentially under modelling the reality. And then in terms of the three lowest measured values, this is all in table 7.1. The three lowest are BRW 15, 36 and 38. Those ones were all modelled at over 100%. And in the case of BRW 38, that was 127% of the reality. I mean, you could always ask for more with these sorts of things. Like I say, I'm not critical of the content within that report as it stands. My issue is the relationship between that report and the real world. But it strikes me that the fact that given that you can see that that's going on, there's both at the top end and the bottom end of the measured rates from BRW sites, and again, this is just for NO2. There are question marks in my mind about whether the model is actually capturing what's going on in the real world, because there seems to be as it were, a divergence once you get to the more extreme sites. And obviously, particularly the highest measured sites, BRW5, BRW40 and BRW41, they are all actually sites. BRW5 was exceeding the 40%, the 40 parts, whatever exactly the terminology is. It was exceeding the level that it should be exceeding. And BRW40 and BRW41, which are both in Brentwood High Street, were bumping along in 2018 to 2019. They were very, very close to that level. There wasn't a big gap between the red alert level, as it were, and the levels that you're seeing there. So again, although I understand this business about a long-term trajectory coming down, those are levels in terms of the last years where we have monitored where they're still issued. And although those are town centre sites, high street sites, sorry, they are all part of this interconnected network of town centre roads where there are potentials for issues, and there are potentials for issues being generated by the local plan, because the local plan is proposing numerous and quite significant sites in town centre terms in that area. So that those things raise concerns for me. But I think there's an overall point here, and maybe it's worth me just to just make the point about the particulate matter stuff as well. It does concern me that we know for a fact that particulate matter is a significant health risk. We also know that particulate matter, for effectively financial reasons and to some extent practical reasons, hasn't really been monitored at all, but we're kind of extrapolating as far as particulate matter is concerned, even for the current concentrations. Obviously, we're then talking about significant extrapolation across 2033 for those. You start to pile unknowns on unknowns, in my view, as far as that's concerned. And so when you get to the point at the end of the report where we're talking about a negligible impact of the local plan, that all sounds very reassuring. But it's only reassuring if you're believing all of the steps in the process. And again, I think the issue really here that I've got is not so much with what's in F138, it's the assumptions that is relying on. And again, reading somewhat between the lines, although you yourself, Mr. Williams, have said that the the projection is that the amounts of traffic are increasing year on year, according to through the local plan period. And of course, whilst the NO2 levels are projected to decrease because of improvements in technology and engine efficiency and what have you in electric vehicles, where you might take that completely out of the equation, the particulate matter ones won't, because that has to do with there's a phrase somewhere, I'm not sure if I can find it quickly, but it's to do with the vehicle sizes, numbers and speed, and therefore expected to increase as traffic grows. And in my view, the traffic will significantly grow as a consequence of the local plan sites and the close proximity of them, particularly in the town centre. Really, the only way in which the conclusions of the report sort of stand up is if this assumption of traffic growth is being reined right back, and I'm assuming that the assumption of traffic growth is being reined right back because of the sustainable transport undertakings which the council are putting into the local plan. And I've raised my concerns about those before. But the trouble is, you get into something which is almost a circular argument, but it's worse than a circular argument, because local plan development can't be acceptable if the traffic even currently generated and then projected is generated into the future. And in the transport assessment, we've seen, I mean, there are some phrases, some very striking phrases in the transport assessment which start out by saying, when we first modelled the traffic effects, the numbers became so high that we regarded them as being unrealistic. Therefore, we changed the model so that the numbers came back down again. So because it can't be acceptable if those traffic numbers are real, therefore there's an assumption made that the sustainable transport measures will stop the traffic growth. Because the sustainable transport measures stop the traffic growth, air quality problems won't arise, and therefore the proposed local plan development is acceptable. So effectively, you've got a set of sites. You've put the sites into the. I don't mean you in your model, but in terms of the overall traffic assessment, sites which are generating, and in the council's own documents, own reports, are shown to be potentially generating significant amounts of traffic increase. There's a modification then put on that which says, no, that's not going to happen because of these sustainable transport measures. And I mean, as far as I'm concerned, that's just a huge question mark. I don't believe it. I'd love to see it happen, but I don't believe it. And once you've factored all of that in and you assess that through air quality, the apparently bad sites obviously become apparently sites which apparently have negligible effect. And my problem with that is, and this might sound personal, but it's absolutely not. It's not a criticism of the report. My feeling is that you can sum that up with the phrase garbage in, garbage out. The problem here is that the assumption that the traffic won't significantly increase is being factored in, and as a result of that, the air quality, the apparently untroubling report that you've produced, the report that says there will be negligible effect, is all your hard work has been rendered a lot less valuable than I would like it to be, and I'm sure you would like it to be, because it's being massively skewed by that. And I think the fact that, just one more point, the fact that when you're projecting to 2033, the baseline case, the reference case, and the local plan case are coming out so virtually identical to one another, that to me is sort of a suggestion that is going on, because effectively the whole assumption has been built around the idea that the local plan development proposals are not going to have much of an effect on the traffic, and therefore there's no real divergence. It's as if the local plan, all of these big changes which are being proposed, are not really going to have any effect at all. And in order to believe that, you have to believe that that's the case, and I just really can't believe that in the real world. So I mean, I think I've probably said enough on that, but that's where I am, and that's the scale of the issue that I've got. It's not personal, it's not a criticism from ERC, but as I say, I think it's somewhat airtight, and if you start stepping outside it and look at the real world, and the fact that there have been sites monitored in the town centre in the last years when they were monitored that were nudging the critical levels for NO2 and the particulate matter hasn't been monitored, I think it's too easy to set aside the concerns. I think the concerns are still there.
Thank you, Mr. Minot. Mr. Williams.
Yeah, so again, a couple of points. So one is on the verification process itself and the comments about the high and low values. So what the modelling did show was that our modelling shows good agreement for the low values. So the two lowest are actually very close to the measured and modelled concentration. So away from roadside sites, we're quite happy with the model. There's always some uncertainty about modelling. When you carry out this process, if you look at the figure 7.1 and you see all the concentrations below the line, below the one-to-one line, then it raises questions. And we went through various stages to improve the modelling at different stages by changing our input assumptions to make it as good as we could. There is some under-prediction at some of the sites, but the fact that we are predicting over 35 micrograms at some sites, or at least one site, shows that the modelling isn't completely under-predicting everywhere. And we have to take into context what the air quality standard is. So the air quality standard is 40. We've got one measured value over 40, which we're not representing in the model. It's a limitation of the model. But once we go through to projecting to 2033, leaving aside the traffic data issues, concentrations are a lot lower, so they're everywhere below 30 compared to the air quality standard of 40. So even a significant amount of uncertainty isn't going to, we're still not likely to get any exceedances of the air quality standards by that year. In terms of particulate matter, it's worth noting that a smaller proportion of the total concentration of particulate matter is due to traffic than compared to NO2. So there's a larger contribution from other sources and natural sources, domestic combustion, things like that, and a smaller proportion to traffic. So you'd expect the uncertainty in the traffic projections, in the PM particulate projections, to be smaller than for the NO2 because the traffic contribution is smaller. In terms of the actual traffic data, we were provided traffic data. I'm told that it used the worst case data for the local plan allocations. I'm not familiar with how that traffic data is generated, but we were provided data that took into account some natural traffic growth between 2019 and 2033, and then additional growth due to the local plan allocations. As I say, I'm not familiar with how that's generated or the assumptions that were made in that. But with any of this modelling, there is uncertainty. But as it comes out to be negligible, you could still have kind of significant additional growth, and it would still not be a major impact on air quality.
Any further questions, Mr. Minot?
Well, I just thought I've just found the quote, which is from I think it's from the Transport Assessment C35, 6.4.1. I think it's probably worth just saying, and again, this is not Mr. Williams's fault or the CERC's fault. Just to quote that, initial junction modelling highlighted a number of junctions where in the reference case the outputs were unrealistic and demonstrated excessive delays, which are well beyond that which would be deemed a reasonable level of service in terms of time and delays and queues. Section 6.5 below sets out how this has been considered to allow, quote unquote, a more realistic assessment to be undertaken to ascertain the impact of the local plan. Essentially, I mean, if you think about the local plan as being a high wall and there's all of these bricks in place, and if there's a weak brick or there's an area where it's weak, the thing can crack and start falling down. You look at that as a brick which is built well down towards the base of the wall, we're looking at traffic figures which have effectively been remodeled to try and take them away from areas, from levels which are naturally concerning. I mean, I'm not going to propose to go back and talk about all of those levels, but there is data in the transport assessment in various areas which suggests really serious potential for issues. I mean, the delay times at Wilson's Corner, for instance, there are a couple of figures there which suggest well over 400% or close to over 500% actually in one case of the existing delay times at Wilson's Corner as a result of local plan sites. So you obviously did what you did with the data that you were given and told to work with, and that's not your fault. The concerns I'm raising at this point are basically saying, this is why I'm saying I've got problems with what you've done as an impressive document in itself, but as somewhat, if you look at it if you reference everything internally, it's brilliant. I'm not professional, you're the professional. You've done a lot of great hard work, and there's an immense amount of detail in there, and it's very impressive. But then you start trying to work out how well that relates to the world outside the document, which is the world that obviously the real people of Brentwood in the future have to live in, and the air that they have to breathe in. And as I say, I've got concerns about the strength of that relationship. I really feel that there are significant issues, and unfortunately, very unfortunately, they're not being captured. They haven't been captured in the work that's been done so far, and that's not your fault. You've done what you can with what you were presented with. So,
in response to what Mr. Minot has just said, can I bring the council in? Because obviously it's not Mr. Williams' job to respond on that point, because that's in relation to the transport assessment. So can I bring the council in to just respond on the points? Because I was going to ask some questions about what the TA says in relation to air quality, which obviously I'm not expecting Mr. Williams to respond on, because that wasn't his remit, was to produce this report. So I don't know if you if the council wants to respond, because the transport, one of my questions was that the transport assessment makes the assumption that there is likely to be an impact on air quality, particularly in the two growth corridors. It makes the assumption of that, and obviously then one of our question 193 of our MIQs was looking at work that's ongoing in order to assess impacts on the A127 and the Lower Thames Crossing, etc., and the implications for the southern growth corridor for air quality, and that there was going to be further work. Now, I don't know whether that's, and one of the questions that obviously we set out last year was, when will this assessment be completed? Is there any sort of update on that in terms of the implications for, I know it's sort of moving slightly away from what Mr. Minot has said, but in response to what Mr. Minot has said about what the TA says, and obviously this air quality assessment was a high level local plan in its entirety sort of assessment, not a more localized. Are you saying that more localized assessments are going on at the moment, or will be, or is that something to be determined through individual planning applications?
Just bear with me. I just want to make sure I've got this right.
Yep, that's fine. Thank you.
Right. First of all, the TA, the information which fed into this report, the Cambridge report, was the January 2021 TA. And the assumptions used for the purposes of this assessment, air quality assessment, at plan level, was the worst case scenario. And it was on that basis that this report concluded that the addition of emissions from vehicles, domestic and commercial combustion, which one could relate to local plan growth, increase concentrations slightly along the main roads, in particular along the A127, but the significance of that growth or that increase was not such as to cause any concern, because it was still well below prescribed levels. So it was negligible. The increase was negligible. It is not intended to carry out any further plan level assessments, but assessments will or may be required in relation to developments as they come forward through the development management process. I just want to make sure I've got that right. I'm looking at those instructing me, and I'm getting nodding heads.
Thank you. Is there anything further that the council wants to respond on to Mr. Minot's points, particularly in relation to the transport assessment? But we're obviously only dealing with air quality aspects of that here. Or is there anything, or Mr. Williams, is there anything further you want to add to anything that you've heard from Mr. Minot?
I think the only thing I would say is that there is uncertainty in the modelling. I think one of the things we can see from the modelling that we carried out is that the largest increases in concentrations along the A127 and some of the other major roads. But along those roads, there's very little public exposure. There's few houses close to the roads. It's not like in the city centre where there's houses immediately adjacent to the roads. So that's part of the reason why that air quality impact will be negligible, and there's kind of leeway there as well.
I suspect, I think Mr. Colin Phone's now not on the call anymore, but I suspect he would make the point in relation to that you have sites in West Horndon right up to the A127, the northern extensions, I think it's Station Road of West Horndon. You have properties which extend right up to the A127. So although in general, obviously, people are not living along the A127, you do certainly have properties which will fall into an area which will be significantly affected. And obviously that is one of the diagrams in F138 shows that is the area of significant change. So it's definitely not the case that nobody would be affected by that. I mean, I feel that there are likely to be sites in the town centre, in the sense that the areas which are close to the A12, and again, there are two local plan sites which straddle the A12. I feel that there would be significant effects there because it is a major strategic route, and even if the effects of the NO2, whatever happens to that, and the particulate matter are concentrated in those areas, it's very, very unwise to be talking about development which effectively places the threat of an effect on the future residents of those properties by choosing to locate those sites in those areas. But I don't want to go any further on that, I think.
Thank you, Mr. Minot. Can I bring in Mr. Barnes and then give the council opportunity, because I would like to move on to look at exactly what the policy is saying, and we are supposed to be finishing around 1 o'clock, although I don't mind going slightly over, so that we can finish this morning. Mr. Barnes, please.
So it's only a very quick point. Just picking up Mr. Minot's comment about proximity to the A127. Obviously, I just speak from a Dunton perspective. Yes, and picking up Mr. Sharadavian's comments. Yes, we, as part of that application, we are being required through the screening opinion to undertake air quality assessments. And yes, we've had to consider that type of issue as proximity to A127 in the master planning of the Dunton site itself. I'm not suggesting that is the be all and end all. I'm just saying it is a point that we are working with the council, actually councils in the area on to ensure that air quality point matters are picked up and taken forward from the work that Mr. Williams has done.
Thank you. Anything further that the council wants to respond to the points that have been raised?
I don't think so, Ma'am, other than to just remind ourselves that we take a worst case scenario, and the objective is actually to achieve a very high degree of internalisation, particularly in relation to the major allocations.
Mr. Minot, was there anything further you wanted to say? Because I would like to move on to policy NE05 to just look at the wording of that, not necessarily all of it in detail. But is there anything further you want to add before I just move on to what the policy is trying to achieve?
No, I think I'm okay. Thanks very much.
Lovely. Thank you, Mr. Minot. Can we just have a look at the policy now? The suggested changes to the policy. So there is obviously the actual policy in the plan, the submitted plan. NE05. And the council has put forward through F9A and participants will have received the updated suggested text, which takes on board what's been set out in F9A and in the council's hearing statements, so that it's all in one place. So you've got that in front of you. Has anybody got any particular comments that they wish to make on this just at this stage? I realise that, again, this was sent quite late yesterday, but what I didn't want to do is have a discussion about the F9A version. The F9A version has been around for a long time. We can have a discussion on that version, or potential version. I thought it was more appropriate to have a discussion on the further suggestions that the council's working on. So
I think that's probably right, Mom.
Well, can the council just explain the changes, particularly from those that are sort of set out in F9A, the changes that you're proposing and why, and is it in relation to, because obviously we've now got the revised 2021 framework as well, so are there implications of that?
I don't think there are any implications from the 2021 framework, although we need to check that to make absolutely sure.
Yeah.
The changes from F9A are essentially, I've just lost it. Excuse me. Where's it gone? Just bear with me, Mom.
That's okay. I've got to find it. I've got to find it myself
My
because I've
computer
just lost
slows
it.
right down when I'm on Teams.
Yeah, I've got it back up. There we go.
I'm nearly there. Oh, thank you. Yeah, the originally proposed amendments to NE05 were quite limited. What we've done actually is look at this in the context of up-to-date guidance, and they align better now with national policy particularly in relation to the issue of exposure and cumulative impacts. And we think the policy as set out now is effective, and not just more effective, but effective, having regard to national policy and guidance. And the criteria is more explicit and more detailed, which assists in assessing proposals at development management stage, which is really what this policy is all about. What's important, and the way it's expressed here, is that objectives should not be compromised, so that those matters in subparagraphs A, B, C are avoided. And then B is a positive policy, part of the policy, requiring designs to minimize exposure to existing poor quality, air quality, and to make appropriate provision to improve local air quality conditions through appropriate design solutions for both indoor and outdoor environments. So our view is actually that these suggested further amendments are needed in order to make this particular policy effective.
Has anybody got any comments that they wish to make at this level? I recognise that people haven't been given too long to consider it, but if there are some initial thoughts on the policy or the suggested changes to the policy compared to the submitted policy. No? Okay. I'll have a look at that then in a bit more detail. I suppose it's understanding, I suppose my only query is about reference to existing areas of poor air quality. So for instance, in AC, you're saying quite rightly that development proposals must demonstrate they will not create unacceptable risk of high levels of exposure to poor air quality. And then you talk about, and then it references used by those, which I presume is obviously is people, because it's people that are affected by air quality, not property or things, by those particularly vulnerable to poor air quality, and you've listed those as such as children and older adults. On that note, I know that there are three, and this is sort of the final point really, there are the three air quality management areas within the borough. My understanding, and please correct me if I'm wrong, is that the council is, I can't remember which document you've set it out in, but I think you've stated that there is a real chance that those air quality management areas will be going soon because the levels of air quality has improved to such an extent that it's now gone under or potentially under the level at which an air quality management area needs to come in. Is my understanding correct on that?
It is correct, Mark. I'll get the right document.
It's in the, isn't it in the annual?
It's in the,
the annual report, I think.
Just bear with me.
Thank you.
Tom is looking at it now. We'll come back to you on that, but you're quite
That's
right.
okay.
They will disappear. I think the point about is the policy ought to be precautionary and not anticipate that outcome. I'll give you the reference as soon as I get it, Mark.
That's fine. Thank you. And in relation to, because this again was one of my sort of original questions that I was going to ask was that with the development that's occurring, I just want clarification from the council that they don't anticipate any further AQMAs being created from the proposed planned growth at this stage, obviously.
That is our working
That's your
assumption.
understanding.
Yeah.
Okay. Now, I was just going to try and find, is it F18? Which is the Air Quality Annual Status Report. I think it's stated in there, isn't it?
Yeah, it's F5J and F18
F5J.
and
Okay.
F18.
Okay, great, thank you. Yes, F5J was your statement, wasn't it?
That's correct, Mom.
In response to initial questions, I think, if I remember correctly. So, okay, great. Thank you very much for that. I don't have any further questions on that particular on air quality. So has anybody got anything that they wish to raise or bring to our attention before we close this session? Mr. Minot, please.
Yes, thank you. I don't think anybody will be surprised to hear me say that I would be alarmed, frankly, if the council was to stop doing air quality monitoring in air quality monitoring areas just at the same time as finalising the process of approving all of these new developments in the local plan. I think the level of uncertainties are such that it would be very difficult to justify that. The fact that there are certain sites, and including the town centre, the high street, BRW sites 40 and 41, which were the last time they were monitored, they were very close to the levels that are of concern as far as NO2 levels are concerned. It would be very difficult from my point of view for that to be justified. At the very least, one needs to track what the consequences of all these new proposals are as they start coming on board, assuming that they do start coming on board. And you could well, and it may not be the right time to do it, but you could well contemplate the potential necessity for some significant air quality monitoring to be going on again in relation to West Taunton or Dunton Hills, because of the potential impact of that. So, I mean, I'm clearly there will be some air quality monitoring, I'm sure, at some points, but for there not to be areas where this is going on a more regular basis, I think would be a matter of great concern. I also did have a question in relation to the modifications of NE05. Where it says in what is now C, subsection E, it says new build developments in areas along busy or congested road and rail lines where the residents will be exposed to poor air quality. And this is talking in terms of there being an air quality assessment required as part of a planning application. Obviously, given that the F138 document that we've just seen and been talking about is effectively suggesting that the areas of poor air quality as far as that document's concerned will be very, very limited. Is that going to be the criterion by which it is judged whether an area will be quote unquote exposed to poor air quality, or will there be some other way of assessing whether a specific area will be exposed to poor air quality? Because again, you get into a bit of a circular argument there. If you're assuming there won't be poor air quality, and you don't, and particularly if you don't monitor, how do you know whether there quote unquote will be poor air quality? So if there's somebody who can answer that question.
Well, the simple response to that is if there is a likelihood of that occurring, then the development management stage will require information in order to tell us what the extent of that exposure is by reference to the air quality. You have to, in these circumstances, you have to assume that the local planning authority is going to carry out its assessments thoroughly, taking into account all material factors. And that is exactly what this policy promotes.
Mr. Minor, is your concern that if there isn't monitoring, how do the applicants know what the baseline is? And therefore, then how do they know what the assessment is? Is that what your concern is?
Yes, to some extent. I mean, I think there are two separate things here. There's obviously what the council is doing in terms of air quality monitoring areas, whether or not there's an application going on, and then there's the question of how the process is applied in terms of individual applications. I think the point I'm making is just in terms of, as usual, I read words and you look at those words and you think to yourself, I don't know when something is being triggered and when it's not being triggered. I'm not critical of Mr. Shadrevin's explanation, but it's effectively being triggered by some planning officer at the council feeling that there is a potential concern, which obviously it leaves it down to the decisions of individual planning officers.
I understand your concern, because what C is saying is that an air quality assessment will be required if, basically, and then for new build developments in areas along, etc. So who will decide whether that air quality assessment is required? So is my understanding correct now?
Yes.
That's what your concern is. Okay. Can the council respond on that, please? Who will make the decision as to whether something will be in a poor air quality area and therefore requires an air quality assessment?
Dare I say, the case officer, in consultation with other officers of the council. If an area is known to produce air quality which is of poor quality, then that would, of course, trigger awareness of the issue. So we're talking about, this is directed towards locations which are likely to give rise to that concern. So development in close proximity to highly trafficked roads, for example. So this is contingent. We're talking about a policy which is which contains contingencies to cater for those circumstances. And so what the officer will do is say, well, I think we need more information here about air quality and its impact upon the potential residents of the proposed development. It's not going to impact on the allocations, is it? Because they've been assessed already.
Can I just come back on that?
As part of this overall modelling work which has been done.
Mr. Minot.
Yeah, I think from the council's point of view, if you have a developer who seeing NEO 5 as it's finally adopted, assuming that it is finally adopted and it has that wording in it, and a developer is being asked to provide an air quality assessment where an area will have poor air quality, but the council is not actually monitoring air quality, isn't that putting the council into a relatively weak position if the developer wants to push back and says, well, how do you know this is going to have poor air quality? If there hasn't been any monitoring for a while and the council hasn't got anything to hold up and say this monitoring suggests that there potentially would be an issue here, and the developer has the opportunity to point at documents like F138, which suggests there's going to be negligible impact, and we're talking in terms of local plan allocated sites here, for instance. The developer could point at that and say, well, look, your own documentation is suggesting there really aren't any concerns here. Why do I need to do this? Surely the council needs some ammunition to say, well, actually, we've got some evidence that this probably does need to be done because there may be poor air quality here, and we need you to do it.
Well, at the moment, the air quality management areas exist. We're predicting that they probably won't exist in the future because of improvements. Those things need to be monitored, not only as part of the local authorities' duties generally, but also as part of reviews of the plan. I'm not just talking about an early review, I'm talking about the duty to undertake reviews every 5 years. So it's not as if everything's just going to go away and the council is going to forget about its duties in regard to air quality. It's just not going to happen.
Thank you. Anything further on air quality? Because I would like to bring the session to a close. We have just hit 1 o'clock, but
nothing from the council, Ma'am.
Okay.
Thank you.
Mr. Minot?
Well, I don't want to continually go back over it, but I would agree that the council does need to be monitoring air quality, given that, as has just been established in documents like F5J and F18, the council is essentially suggesting that it will stop monitoring air quality because air quality is improving. That's effectively suggesting that something like that will stop, and it would be much more reassuring if that suggestion wasn't there.
Well, can I suggest you have that conversation outside the remits of the local plan, because the monitoring is not part of the local plan policy. Obviously, we want the wording to be right, and then if you can have that internal chat with relevant council officers or other council members, etc., if you can have that discussion, then that may give you some comfort. But what obviously we're interested in is the actual policy wording itself, and whether that then provides the necessary hook to ensure that developments do accord with their air quality duties and accord with the legislation, etc. Okay, is that okay, Mr. Minot?
Yep.
Great, lovely, thank you. But I would have that conversation within the council. Thank you. Okay, thank you very much then, ladies and gentlemen. I'd like to draw this session to a close. Thank you for your contributions, really helpful. We are back on tomorrow morning. It's just an outstanding issues session with the council only, just so that we can give some potential direction on some areas where the council has requested that as part of other hearing sessions, etc. It's not going to be a long session at all, but obviously observers can observe, watching it live streaming and on record. So thank you very much for today's session. It's been really helpful. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ma'am.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.